All right, folks. So we are rolling, we are recording. So first, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Brunel University London Center for Culture and Evolution Spring 2022 Research Seminar Series on community engaged research in the cultural and evolutionary sciences. This is something of a soft launch, so apologies everyone for the late notice. There will be a host of interesting talks over the next few months, and we'll soon be distributing a more comprehensive schedule, although as with so much right now, it will be somewhat tentative. But today it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Nettle from our northern neighbor, Newcastle University. Daniel calls himself a behavioral scientist with research interests spanning the biological and social sciences, including the origins and consequences of social inequality, trust, cooperation, and antisocial behavior, and meta-scientific interests, including the philosophy of scientific explanations, the virtues and vices of disciplinarity, and open science. His interests are remarkably broad, but that hasn't stopped him from making fundamental contributions in many domains, using methods that range from mathematical modeling to the kind of work we'll hear about today, community engaged multi-method social science. Before we get to that, I'd like to share one anecdote about Daniel. So about a decade ago, when I was a wee grad student, I received advice from my advisor, Dan Fessler, about how to be successful in academia. And that advice was, and I quote, "Do what Daniel Nettle does." So that is, have broad interests, collaborate widely, and do a bunch of interesting creative studies. Now, it turns out that's a lot easier said than done. And in fact, Daniel will be the first to tell you that he's the last person early career researchers should emulate if they plan to hang on to the edges, to use his phrase. But fortunately, a couple of years ago, he published a set of essays called Hanging On to the Edges that I think provides kind of invaluable, humble and wise perspective for early career researchers. And I would encourage everybody to check that out. And so again, very happy to introduce Daniel.
Thanks, Matt. I'm taken aback at that essay. I can only think that, Dan knew me before I went over to the dark side, right? So just this terrible advice, don't ever emulate, what anyone does actually, but particularly me. So it's a very good anecdote, though. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, it's lovely to be here and nice to see some familiar faces. What I've prepared today is relatively informal. I've just put some sort of graphs and things onto some slides because I got the sense from the nature of the invitation that you weren't quite looking for your standard study 1, study 2, study 3, thank you very much, research seminar, but wanted a bit more of a kind of to foster a dialogue about community engaged research, which I think is a very interesting topic. So I'll present some personal reflections, and it will involve presenting a bit of data just to show you the kind of things that I've done. But then I'm hoping we can have some discussion. If you've got burning questions as you go, by all means interrupt or put something in the chat, and Matt, maybe you can monitor the chat in case anything comes through. But I'm planning to leave a bunch of time at the end, and I'm very happy to talk to anyone about the issues raised. As I say, this is not a kind of highly polished performance, but just some personal reflections on my attempts to do community engaged research. So, all right, I'll start at the beginning somewhere. We pride ourselves in the evolutionary and cultural evolutionary behavioral sciences on having this kind of wonderful theory that spans all kinds of domains of human activity and is really sensitive to the ecology in which people live. It's informed by the kinds of struggles that people face and the adaptive challenges that they have and the environments in which they do them, and the fact that they're very responsible to their environments. Behavioral ecology is a theory of the fit between organism and environment. So what we ought to do ought to be great for thinking about how people are affected by their ecology. And yet the oddity is most of us do studies on Amazon Mechanical Turk or with undergraduates or whatever. And that's fine, but actually it's very decontextualized. It doesn't really take into account in any systematic way the variation in environmental inputs that people are getting. Now, of course, there's cross-cultural research, which is, go off to a field site in some far-flung country, and one or several, and study processes maybe amongst people who live in a very different way. And of course, that's very valuable and very important, but I'm going to have some kind of comments about that. But mainly I want to say that Amazon Mechanical Turk, or your undergraduate participant pool, and Vanuatu are not your only two choices, right? And we would do well to remember that there's kind of many other things you can do in between. Anyway, so about in the early 2000s, I was thinking a lot about the theoretical basis of my work and the sort of empirical basis of it, and was just very struck really that the environmental experience of people outside the university in the city where I live is very different from mine. Okay, so you might live on this street, for example, which is about a mile from where I live, where everyone puts either broken glass or barbed wire on their back walls, and the place is kind of a mess, and it's clearly a kind of environment that's replete with a certain kind of experience. And actually, this summer I worked on a vaccine bus, which we parked up at the end of this street, and vaccinated the people who turned up, who were not very many by and large. And it turns out, of course, that they had very interesting issues, and their issues in accessing health services and having NHS numbers and all of that stuff turn out to be very different, which is why that neighborhood had a very low vaccination rate, and why we put a bus at the very end of this street, because we sort of knew that people there weren't accessing services in the way that other people might have been. So here we are with this great theory about the ecology in which people live, but yet we study them in the rather disembodied ecology of the university. And there's other ecologies like this, which is just a few yards down the road. And I thought, well, there's a sort of terrible disconnect between the grand claims I make for my behavioral ecological perspective and the actuality of what I research, which is, most people don't go through particularly the people who live on this street, but actually most people aren't sitting in there thinking, God, I wonder if that old friend of mine, Linda, is more likely to be a bank teller or a feminist bank teller, or, I just can't decide between this short-term mating with this waist ratio and this long-term mating with this other one. I mean, this is not probably the issues that they're thinking about, right? So here I am with this grand theory of the organism and the environment, but I'm probably asking questions that have no real relevance and don't sort of respond to the ecology of the city I live in. So that sort of became a bit of a mental bugbear. So we had around that time, you remember, the publication of these very influential studies showing that, for example, in the dictator game, which is shown here, people in different parts of the world, whether they're in the States or in Kenya or in Ecuador or wherever, transfer different amounts on average in the dictator game, which is this game where you have $10 and you can transfer up to 10 to another party. And I thought, well, this is kind of quite interesting, but in a way, there's something quite deflationary about these differences, which is actually the differences are really small. Okay, and we don't know how to account for them, because the people in Missouri were tested by a different experimenter, and they were tested in a different currency with a different resource that had a different value to them on a different day by a different experimenter in a different language. And yet the differences are actually pretty small, right? I mean, pretty much in every culture that's ever been studied, quite a lot of people offer half, and then some other people offer less. And the proportions of those vary a bit. But actually, as a demonstration of the radical power of humans to respond to their ecology, it's slightly underwhelming, because the ecology is totally different, multidimensionally, and yet the behavior is actually only sort of subtly different. So I thought that was interesting, but I thought there must be stronger ways of showing that humans, respond to variation in their experience. But this kind of newfound interest in human variation was also very much prominent in my thinking at that time. And I think there are some dangers of this kind of study that also in the study that I ended up doing, and I'd like to talk about those as we go on. But anyway, there were these kinds of studies of cross-cultural variation. But I thought, well, do I have to go to Madagascar to find cross-cultural variation? Or is there variation in both ecology and behavioral phenotype much closer at hand? So this is something about the city where I live, Newcastle upon Tyne. So obviously this is one of the great industrial cities that's now had a period of post-industrial decay. time was along the riverside of this city was amongst the kind of economically most prosperous industrial zones of the world. The whole city had tremendous amounts of coal mining, but also had shipbuilding, armaments building, other kinds of heavy engineering, all of these kinds of things. And they were concentrated along the River Tyne, which is navigable right up to here. So quite big ships would come up. And the whole of the city was highly industrial, in fact, in the 19th century. Since the Second World War, it's undergone a period of very radical deindustrialization and some population loss and just general change. And it's produced this rather interesting consequence that neighborhoods that were formerly would have been very similar to each other 100 or 200 years ago are now really different. And in particular, there's this concentrated area of neighborhoods that are in the most deprived, economically deprived in all of England. You know, these are places where really people the population is smaller than it was 30 years ago, so a lot of people have left. But you know, there's endemic structural problems of people not being able to borrow money to buy housing, housing being dilapidated, underemployment, poor health, these kinds of things. And people really are amongst the poorest people in England. But other areas of the city that have undergone quite a different trajectory. The main employers in Newcastle upon Tyne now are the two universities. Lots of neighbourhoods, you know, are full of people who are doing well from those and other kind of newer industries. So like here in the northern part of the city, you have lots of neighbourhoods that were working class back 100 years ago, but are now actually very affluent and full of people like university professors and other people who work in IT and stuff like that. So very divergent social trajectories. And my thought was, look, these are really different ecologies. What the hell am I doing going to Madagascar or whatever, when in fact I could just go down the road and, you know, presumably would find that people have very different experiences in those two places. And those experiences might be relevant to questions that I'm really theoretically interested in asking. So to cut a long story short, I ended up designing a study where I compared two neighborhoods. One is down here in the west end of the city, and another is up here, sort of in the north central part of the city, of a square mile or two, that we could get census data to show this were really similar in lots of ways, similar sex ratio, similar total population, similar number of households, the same sort of urban density, the same distance from the city centre. By and large, these are white neighbourhoods at that time. This was 10 years ago. There hadn't been a huge amount of immigration. There's been a lot more now. But the big difference is that one was economically very deprived and the other very, very affluent, as shown on that table there. To illustrate that graphically, the government neighbourhood statistics website has this wonderful graphic that you can put in a postcode to find out if you're thinking of buying a house in a neighbourhood. You know, what's it like there? You know, how good are the services? How good, how economically deprived is it? If you put in the two postcodes, the centre of my two study neighbourhoods, you get this for neighbourhood A, you get this least deprived, you know, reassuring odometer there, and for neighbourhood B, you get kind of like, you know, do not pass go, do not collect £200, do not buy a house in this neighbourhood, and indeed, this was a mortgage lending black spot for many decades. People couldn't borrow money on this neighbourhood because building societies literally thought it would cease to exist. And large parts of it actually were torn down, or the neighbourhood down the road were simply torn down. They even erased the streets in the end. So this is a kind of area of historic of deprivation. But that will sound alarming. It's perfectly, you know, it has Asda and you know, coffee shops and all of the things that you want, and I go for a walk there all the time and so on. So just to put it in balanced perspective, this is an ecology that's both familiar and also very different from the kind of places you might know. So I'm just going to spend now a few minutes talking about some of the things I did, just in a very descriptive way. This wasn't terribly hypothesis driven, though I think you can see the kinds of questions it relates to. So it's just to get a sense of, you know, of an idea of the kind of activities I got into, which will lead to these discussions about the pros and cons of community-based research. I suppose in the back of my study, which was going to be about pro-sociality, broadly speaking, were two possible narratives, right? One is sort of comes from Peter Kropotkin, ultimately, that sort of says, cooperation is how humans solve adversity. They pull risk, they pull together, they do things collectively to make harsh environments survivable. And that narrative says, in your poor neighborhood, people are going to be much more pro-social. They're going to cooperate with one another because they don't have the material resources to, buy in services, for example. So they might cooperate in childcare because paid childcare is not accessible to them. And they might lend each other things because they don't have the money to just buy them and so on. So you might expect much more cooperation. And then the alternative narrative is, is a very sort of widespread one, which is that scarcity destroys pro-sociality, because we all become so existentially focused on just getting by, just keeping our own little bit to survive, that we withdraw from pro-social relationships. And so, you'd expect much less pro-social behavior in the more deprived neighborhood. So I did a bunch of different things. The first thing I did, I spent a whole summer just walking around, kind of recording what I saw, and I saw some pretty interesting things. And one of the things I did a census of people on the street at different times of day. And remember, B is the deprived neighborhood, A is the affluent neighborhood. This is actually, doesn't look much, but this is hundreds of hours of work and, many thousands of lines of data. And what it basically shows is that in neighborhood B, the deprived neighborhood, people use their residential streets in the evening. They're out on the street, right? They're on the stoop, as it were. They're out there using the social parts of their environment. And that's particularly true of kids. If you look at what kids do what I did when I was a kid growing up in London, which is you get home from school and you play out. They play on their streets. And anyone who wants to look at the ethology of children's play in the West End of Newcastle is extremely interesting. None of this kind of parental supervision stuff. There are mixed age groups of kids playing their own games the way kids always have. They're often, moderately far away from their houses. They're looking after themselves. They're doing just fine. So kids play out on the street in the evening. You don't see that in the affluent neighborhood at all. Kids go into their houses, the doors are shut. The other thing that happens is adults seem to have a different kind of social relationship. So if you look at the mean size of group of adults who are using the streets in the two neighborhoods by time of day, you're always more likely to have adults with other adults in neighborhood B than you are in neighborhood A. In neighborhood A, adults are often alone. And that's not because in neighborhood B, adults live with other adults. On the contrary, there are more lone adult households. It's just people get together with their friends and they go around doing stuff together with their friends. So on the face of it, it looked like there's a greater sociality, a consistently greater sociality. Other evidence for that is look at the front doors open, many more front doors open in neighborhood B. This was in the summer, there's data. Way into the evening, people just leave their front doors open and they wander in and out of each other's houses and they come out onto the yard and so on. You don't see that so much in neighborhood A. And this is actually a replication of a famous thing that Young and Wilmot did in their book, Family and Kinship in East London, then famous 1957 community study. They walked transects of the street and saw how often do you see someone greeting someone that they didn't, that they weren't previously interacting with, like, so someone bumping into someone else on the street and saying hi. This is a sort of index of how well people know each other. And you see a lot more of that stuff in neighborhood B. People run into the people they know on the street and they greet them, and there's a big neighborhood difference in that. So on the face of it, these observations would lead you to say there's a kind of richness of social relationships in this deprived neighborhood. Maybe people are providing services through these informal means, collective childcare and whatnot, by having people that they know in the neighborhood and people they interact with and coming in and out of each other's houses in a way that you don't do when you can afford to opt out of that stuff because you're more affluent. But an interesting thing is, although I think there's a greater intensity of social relationships in neighborhood B, the quality of them is not necessarily the same. So we also ask people, how much do you trust others in your neighborhood? I'm not giving anything like sample sizes or detailed methods for all of this. You just have to take it on trust that we did do things that were moderately sensible. We asked, how much do you trust people? How well do you feel you know your neighbors? How much, to what extent do people around here look out for one another? How many people do you have to turn to if you're in trouble? And you get these big neighborhood differences that are all in the other direction. So in the neighborhood where there's where there's more intense social interaction, there's actually less trust and people don't feel they know their neighbors, which is kind of slightly strange. And in fact, if you plot, you can replot the trust data that I collected to be on the same scale as the World Values Survey trust question. And if you do that, and you plot these two neighborhoods, neighborhood A comes out about as Canada, which is, seems to be about fair. So you get this continuum of trust in general that countries like Scandinavian countries are very high in trust, and then generally the countries that are lower in trust are lower in GDP and lower in some other metrics like quality of governance and so on. And neighborhood A comes out about Canada, and neighborhood B comes out somewhere between Colombia and Zimbabwe. So there's a very dramatic difference. This difference is not trivial, right? It's not kind of a subset of the difference between Britain and the next most trusting country. These are really different places culturally in terms of trust and in other ways. Okay, so I thought this was an interesting thing that the people in neighborhood B seem to have quite a lot of social interaction, but to be anxious about it. Because when you don't trust, precisely what that means is you don't know what other people are going to do. You might be interacting with them, but you don't know what they're going to do next. And that was well captured by an anecdote from an informant who said, the good thing about Scotswood, that neighbourhood B is not Scotswood, it's the next neighbourhood along, but Scotswood was a neighbourhood of Newcastle, now demolished, someone said the good thing about Scotswood was everyone was in and out of each other's houses. The bad thing about Scotswood was that they were stealing each other's stuff, right? So there's this kind of duality that people have very intense social relationships, but they're kind of anxious about them as well. So what would happen? Oh yeah, and by the way, just an interesting anecdote. The real deficit in trust in neighborhood B is among the young, right? So you get, it's really young people who are very alienated actually living in this neighborhood. That you might, why that might be, I don't know, that's sort of beyond what I can demonstrate, but it's an interesting thing. It's young people who are disillusioned. A lot of them are really, in neighborhood B, are really rock bottom on trust. And that's interesting to think about why that might be. Okay, so what would happen if we did the infamous dictator game in our neighborhoods? And we did it three ways in the end. We did the standard dictator game, which is I give you £10. You can keep any amount to yourself and allocate the remainder to another person in your neighborhood. This is all real money. And we just cycled around the neighborhood and took the £10 and stuck it through someone's door. We really did whatever they asked us to do. We had another version where we said, okay, look, you can nominate a friend to be the recipient, right? Which ought to make it more attractive to give more. And we even said we'll double the stake in that one. So if you keep £5, we'll give £10 to your friend. And just give us your friend's address and we'll go over there and stick it through their door. We won't, don't worry, it won't cost them anyway. We'll just put it through their door. But actually, you still, basically people in neighborhood B really didn't want to give any across. And then we said, well, what if it's charity? And that generally ups the giving rate, was a worthy cause. But still in neighborhood B, it's a lot less than in neighborhood A. So people say in the standard dictator game, there's no community anywhere in the world that does the income maximizing thing of keeping it all for themselves. Well, in neighborhood B, there was actually only one person who ever gave any money at all. That's why you've got this very low mean there. So if we plot, on the Henrik et al. 2010 distribution, where do our neighborhoods come, where do they measure up on the dictator game transfer? Neighborhood A is Missouri, and neighborhood B is off the scale. No other population has really been measured where that happens. Now, there's a bunch of explanations for this, including the fact that they were in their houses, we were going around there, there's weird stuff going on. People might not trust researchers. They might not have trusted us to go and deliver the money to the other party like we said we would. There's all kinds of things going on, which might be relevant to the explanation of this, but those things always apply. They apply also in the cross-cultural study as well. You don't really know what you're getting at with these things. Anyway, just worth noting that. Okay, so that's about pro-social behavior. The data game is often taken as a measure of pro-social behavior. What about anti-social behavior? Well, one of the things, again, I've got many hundreds of hours of on-street recordings. You just see people dropping litter. You see people damaging the street furniture, breaking windows, or defacing things. You see people spitting. So you see people doing stuff that's more apparently, a public bad in neighborhood B than A. And indeed, the crime statistics bear this out, that we got the police records, and most types of crime happen much more in neighborhood B, particularly kind of minor, what the police call antisocial behavior, which can actually be a range of things, but kind of minor antisocial behavior goes on. The only type of crime that's less common is vehicle crime, but that's because there are fewer vehicles. Burglary is much more common, even though people probably on average have less valuable stuff in their houses. But actually, it turns out most burglaries are committed very, very close to the burglar's home. Most burglaries happen within a mile of the perpetrator's home, and often, actually, this is a seldom discussed fact. A lot of burglaries are of people who know each other. They burglarize each other. Yeah. So there's a lot more burglary going on, and a lot more violence. These are rate ratios, the numbers at the top of the column. So we wanted to study antisocial behavior in a kind of economic game way. So we devised this thing called the theft game, which was instead of I've got £10 and I can allocate some of it to you, which is the dictator game. In the theft game, we've got £10 each, and I can steal some of yours. Player one is the first mover, and said, do you leave things as they are? We're both going to get £10, or does the first mover, the dictator, be like, take some of the £10 away? And we found in neighborhood B that most people don't take anything away in neighborhood A. A few of them take all of it. They're probably economics students or something. But anyway, that's that. But neighborhood B, there's a real variety of responses, but actually a lot is taken away. Okay, so that was just some background and some data. Now, here we get into the kind of the issues I wanted to talk about today about community-based research. Having kind of gone out into the field and got all these observations, one option is just to write this up and say, here's a neighborhood where all these different things happen. It's really different. It's really different from what we think of as a weird country, and it's really different in all these ways. And write that as a kind of descriptive thing to remind us that the weird label is unhelpful in as much as there's very heterogeneous norms within the Western educated, industrial, rich and democratic society, and there's a lot more diversity there than we realize, and so on. So I could sort of write that up, and in a way that would be a kind of road to Wigan Pier of this work. And if you know this book by George Orwell in the 30s, so Orwell goes up north to Wigan and reports back from how people are living in Wigan. Which turns out, no one in London, no one in Bloomsbury really knew how people live in Wigan. So he writes this extraordinary book, which is a kind of very journalistic, very descriptive account of kind of what people's houses are like and what they eat and all this sort of stuff. And then the second half, which is an attempt to sort of do something with this, and for those of you who've read it, it's very extraordinary. It's a kind of prolonged rant about vegetarianism and stuff like that. It's very bizarre. But anyway, partly he's chastising Fabian socialists for not really knowing what they're talking about and not really knowing how the working class actually live. So anyway, so I could write my sort of Road to Wigan Pier first half of describing all this. But really what I want to talk about today is, would that be good? Is that ethically justified? And, I don't think that's a trivial concern. So first of all, it's very hard to represent the data I've just whizzed through in a way that isn't really bad. Doesn't look really bad for the residents of neighborhood B. Right? It just looks really stigmatizing. It says, look, here's these people. You think Western, societies and how orderly they are and how market integrated they are and how we all collaborate furiously well with strangers. And here's these terrible people, who are doing this awful stuff that is just really a kind of like a Hobbesian sort of anarchy at the margins of the university. And this could be a really terrible thing to write up. A, because I think that lacks any kind of nuance. And B, because, you know, humans uniquely are the species where our representations of them become causal in their future behavior. So in a sense, if I want to say, oh, look, you know, neighborhood B is really, really, you know, dysfunctional in these ways, that's really on the heroic assumption that anyone would ever read my research, which is probably unlikely to happen. That's actually potentially causally really important. People going, God, that's a rough neighborhood. I'm not going to move there. You know, I wouldn't buy a house there, or I wouldn't move in. You know, it's sort of those representations, which already exist and are very negative within the city, and also, you know, within sort of political thought more generally, you know, could become causally important in perpetuating a certain way of thinking. So that's point one. Point two is that the measures I took were just sort of pretty unsophisticated, you know, things like dictator games. I just sort of took something that existed in the literature and imported. And, you know, we should all be terribly aware that the measures we take, you know, the dictator game is a really bad measure of pro-sociality. I mean, we don't even know what it's measuring. So taking it into this particular community and saying, aha, you know, they're not pro-social, it's a very dangerous inference. I'm sure people are very pro-social in lots of ways. Just maybe the dictator game, for whatever reason, was not picking up the particular nature of, or you know, made social interaction there appear in a certain light. Another thing is, and this is my concern actually with cross-cultural cognitive science more generally, by the very nature of the thing we do, which is to focus on behavior and cognition, rather than, for example, the material determinants of life or the structural determinants of life, we provoke in people's mind a particular type of explanation. Oh, look, there's these people in neighborhood B, you know, they don't trust each other, and they're kind of, you know, have these problematic social relationships. By invoking the notion of culture, and by the type of measures I take, that already exoticizes and essentializes the people who live there. Oh, they've got this culture thing that makes them do these strange things. They don't give each other money, and they don't trust each other. That sort of both makes that slightly mysterious and internalizes it and essentializes it in the people who are there. Now, social anthropologists who write against the notion of culture, this is exactly what they're concerned about. We can say, oh, the whatever, you know, the Fiem culture is such and such. And this kind of both makes the causal origins of it mysterious and kind of underestimates the diversity and plasticity and you know, immediate situational determinedness of the things that people are doing in that place. So depending on how I wrote this up, I could end up just kind of perpetuating a load of essentialist stereotypes about you know, a certain type of person, which are already really prevalent, right? And this is not a good thing to do. It's not okay to do that, I think. And I still worry really about, you know, whether my work kind of ultimately can hold its head up in that way. And then the third thing is, for all of this, I hadn't really addressed, and I still haven't really addressed, what are the concerns of the people who live in this ecology? You know, what do they think about? What do they take pro-social action to be, and to what extent do they think they're doing it? Now, I can tell you that they're pretty dissatisfied with the social life of the place they live in, on average. So it's not like I'm saying there's social problems in this area and they disagree. I think overwhelmingly everyone I spoke to would probably agree with that. They would also think that was the case. But their explanations of it would not be to do with culture, or they would say things like, we've got crap public transport. The benefit system of this country is really bad, right? You know, we don't have good jobs. And so in a way, if you start saying, oh, there's this kind of slightly nebulous thing, causally mysterious thing called culture, you automatically are drawing attention away from very concrete things like bus routes and universal credit, and you know, these kinds of things, which actually is possibly the thing we ought to be talking about, and probably would be closer to the concerns of the people who live there. So there's a sort of worry that my research, you know, although it seems community engaged, ends up kind of trivial and extractive of the people who live in neighborhood B. Oh, look, you know, there's these funny exotic people who don't behave like us, and guess what? They only live 2 miles down the road. So I'm pretty uncomfortable about that. And actually, it reminds me, so I actually started out as an Africanist years ago, and I wrote a description of a language of the central Nigerian highlands, and there was always a sort of saying amongst linguistic anthropologists at the time that, you know, when a linguist turns up to document a language, that people are really excited, and then the linguist gets to the end of the year and they only ever do the phonology, right? You know, they like describe the phonology, and they go away, and the people go, well, I knew the phonology of my language. This doesn't do me much good. Like the informants, you know, it just stopped at the point it was getting interesting. And I worried that in a way I did the same. You know, I stopped. I got some data, I got some publications, but did I stop at the point where it was kind of getting interesting in terms of actually finding out what people's concerns were? Now, these are the sort of issues I'd like to discuss, but let me just do a little bit more. So I actually ummed and ahed a long time about whether I should even publish any of this stuff, because absent a kind of causal theory of what's going on, it just seems to me to be kind of some kind of slightly nasty documentation of some things that are happening in somewhere. It doesn't really provide an intervention to improve things, or, you know, lay the causal finger of the causal arrow in any particularly compelling way. And it just, I'm not sure how that helps. In the end, I did decide to write it up and publish it, and I think it's important to do that, perhaps just to bear witness to the variation in human experience that exists even within, you know, a single country. But I think there are some things that, for me, probably save this project as being kind of ethically acceptable, or I like to think that they do anyway. So one of them was, when you do a neighborhood study or a community study, you're not destined merely to describe differences. You can also try and explain them, and explanation is a very powerful thing. So, for example, just to give you a couple of little examples of things we're able to do, this theft game business I told you about, that people are taking more in neighborhood B than A. We also ask people, how acceptable is it to steal from others? And how prevalent is it in this neighborhood that people steal from others? And you find actually there's no social difference, no neighborhood difference in the acceptability. The difference resides in the perceived prevalence. So people in neighborhood B think other people in neighborhood B will be likely to steal. So, but the fact there's no difference in the acceptability tells us there's no fundamental moral difference, right, between people living in these neighborhoods. People think that stealing is bad, you shouldn't do that. But they just think other people are doing it, right? So this sort of, they have a representation that others will do it. And the thing that turns out to predict how much you take in this game is not how morally acceptable you think it is to take. Lots of people think it's not morally acceptable at all, but still take all of it. And some people think it is quite morally acceptable, but still don't take any of it, right? So what you think is morally acceptable is not what's driving what you do. What's driving what you do, if anything, is what you think others will do. The golden rule, right? If everyone's going to steal from me, I'm not, you know, it's like the race to the bottom in the public goods game. It's the same thing. So this sort of suggests that there's no kind of fundamental moral cleavage between these two neighborhoods. The point is that half the people live in an environment where they, you know, they worry about what others will do. And then you can think about, well, why have they come to be in that state? It doesn't explain it, or it's only a very immediate type of explanation. But we begin to be able to sort of scratch below the surface into really what the differences were here. And then the other thing, the thing that I'm most proud about this whole project, and I think the most important thing about it is the following experiment. It's very easy to kind of, as I say, essentialize these differences and say, oh, these people in neighborhood B are just really different. They have like a different psychology or a different culture or something. But there's another approach to it, which is to say, they're just exactly the same. Like, people are just the same in all profound respects. They're just in neighborhood B. They're in a different place, and place is driving a lot of this. Because if you're in neighborhood B, you go past sites like this all the time, like places that are boarded up, places that have broken windows, places that have barbed wire. So you have a different kind of sensory experience. So the study we did was, we got experimental volunteers, and we simply put them in taxis and sent them to either neighborhood B or neighborhood A, and had them wander around for an hour. We gave them some things to do. We gave them a map and some things to do. And then we asked them a load of questions about their social trust and their paranoia and things like that. And by the end of the hour, this is, I think, the most important thing is, so we've got two groups of participants in this study. We've got the residents of the two neighborhoods we've surveyed extensively. And we've got the visitors, which is the 50 people that we had stuck into taxis and driven off to different parts of the city. So in the first pair of bars there, you see the residents' scores. And in the second pair of bars, you see the visitors. So these are the people who an hour before have been in the university and have been bused to one or other of these neighborhoods. And the outcome variables are social trust, the world value survey question, paranoia, which you measure with the clinical paranoia scale, and personal trust, which is trust in people you know well. So by the end of an hour, the visitors to neighborhoods A and B looked exactly like the residents. So if you send them to a middle-class neighborhood, you know, where everything's safe and there's plenty of resources and there's no litter and broken windows and so on, they feel pretty trusting after an hour. And if you send them to neighborhood B, they feel less trusting after an hour. Now, this is kind of important because it suggests that this is plasticity. This is people responding to their immediate experience, which means that, you know, it suggests, that doesn't prove, that if you could change their immediate experience, that if you actually, you know, improve the housing and the bus routes and, you know, the material environment and all that, you can make a big difference here. This isn't some sort of essential thing about neighborhood B. I mean, the study we really wanted to do was we wanted to take people from one neighborhood and you know, move them to the other neighborhood and vice versa, and just say, you know, does that swap things around? But anyway, at the very least, this demonstrates there's a bunch of plasticity in this. The same with paranoia, right? There's a paranoia difference between the residents of the two neighborhoods, but you can reproduce that in visitors with only an hour there. The only difference you can't reproduce is the lower personal trust, which is trusting people you know. But that's fine, because that makes sense, because our visitors, we hadn't manipulated who they already knew. We'd only manipulated, you know, like the broader sort of set of people who are around them. So I think this is the most important study, because it says that what I want you to take away from this whole project is not that there's some intrinsic difference between the people in neighborhood B and neighborhood A. What I want you to take away from this is that environment matters. And there's a series of follow-ups I want to do where we actually try and figure out what about environment matters. Is it the litter on the ground? You know, is it the physical environment? And we'd like to go into virtual reality to try and tease that apart, because then it becomes less of a kind of account of, look, all these funny people over here, they have these norms. Isn't that exotic? And it becomes more of a causal account of what are the psychological consequences of particular types of environments. And that links much better to public policy, because public policy is about doing things that might change an environment. So it seems to me that that's kind of more ethically justifiable as a sort of research approach. So not merely going to extract data on norms and behavior from neighborhood B, but actually finding out what it is about neighborhood B that makes people think the way that they do, on the assumption that, and that would apply then to anyone who went. And moreover, I mean, I think that the key to good community research, and I don't think this is very good community research because I kind of ran out of steam at this point, and that was some years ago now, would mix an a prioristic interest in, you know, in theoretical questions with actually finding out what do people think, like what do they think their problems are, what do they think their main concerns are, because then you can actually redesign your materials and your stimuli to be kind of relevant to their concerns. And I think we only scratched the surface of that. There's a bunch of stuff to talk about here, and something I was talking about with Matt earlier in a one-on-one conversation was, one of the things you need to get, and we never successfully did this, is a sort of base in a community center. You need to be resident there, you need to be in a community hub, or you need to be in a church or plug into sort of a group, you know, something in the neighborhood or in the community that's a way in for you to those researchers, to establish you with some permanence and some relationships. We did a lot of door-to-door stuff, and that never really happened. One of the problems is, and this is very well understood in sociology, is that poor areas don't have the social capital. They don't have the residents association and the allotment growers association and the, you know, they simply don't have. Were I to do this, I actually live quite close to neighborhood B, but in a little square that's been rather gentrified. And we have like a historical society because it's the buildings are all old, and a community association. And, you know, so I could totally plug into that community in 5 minutes, exactly because it has this high social capital, high trust situation that you just don't have somewhere like this, like neighborhood B, or much less so. With the exception, actually, now there's been more immigration of certain ethnic groups, which I think you could plug into because they have a kind of high internal social capital. So there's a real challenge there about how you do community research as sort of becoming embedded and not just sort of flying through, which, as I say, I don't think I ever really solved. So that's all I've got. I don't know if that's been helpful or relevant, but I'd prefer from this point on maybe just to turn it into more of a discussion and get your input, if that makes sense. I'll stop sharing so I can see your face, but we can always go back to the slides if we need to.
That's excellent. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. We've got some applause going up. You can't hear them, but the yellow hands were a bit jaundiced here in Uxbridge, I guess, but they are resounding. Yeah, so folks, feel free to raise a hand. I see Michael Price just shot his up. Zoom has the hand function. Please raise that. You can also put questions in the chat, which I'll keep my eyes on. So Michael, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Dan. You can hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting talk, Dan. And I just have, sorry, because this is such a general theoretical question just about your basic approach, but I guess I was just, struck by one of your last comments is that, the environment matters. And I really wholeheartedly agree with that assessment. I guess I'm wondering how does your approach to this relate to sort of UCSB school kind of evolutionary psychological approach to information processing, which is very similar to saying the environment matters, the information matters, information processing matters. So we have the same minds processing different environmental information. Do you see this as sort of compatible with that approach, or if so, if not, why not? Thanks.
No, I see it as very compatible. I mean, I think that the notion of evoked culture and the notion and that result with the people bus to the different neighborhoods seems to me to fit pretty well. I mean, it's too grand a claim to say that the study had any particular kind of theoretical view of the mind. It was more descriptive and tentative than that. But I think it's completely compatible. So one of the things, is a bugbear of mine, and probably yours as well, Michael, is the persistent misunderstanding of that UCSB approach as sort of somehow implying that context doesn't matter, whereas I think it gives you a good handle on why context matters in some of the ways that it matters. So I would see that as totally compatible, and I would love to do it. I love to do it again in ways that were more theoretically informed by some of that, particularly like virtual reality or giving people different kinds of cues. So yeah, no, I see those as totally, can be totally squared with one another. This is not to imply that I don't believe in transmitted culture or kind of long-term transmission of norms, or I think everything's evoked culture, not at all, but I think it really fits with that view. By the way, just briefly, having read Tom Dickens' new book, we should be saying data when you said information there. Anyway. Read Tom's chapter 6 if you want to know why. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Daniel. Michelle, you have your hand up?
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question is also about that neighborhood exchange part of the study. And I'm wondering whether the thinking behind that is that it's kind of a direct response to the cues in the environment, or is there a more social interpretation, which is people in the area know these two neighborhoods and they recognize that there are different norms and different statuses in these neighborhoods. And so when they're switching neighborhoods, they're just kind of code switching between social norms here are like that, social norms are here are like that, or maybe even envisioning that they're interacting with a different set of people and they're essentializing about
Yeah.
who lives in which neighborhood and how they're going to treat each other?
So that's a great question. I mean, I've always thought of it more as the former of your two alternatives, but I can't rule out the latter. You'd have to probe the underlying representations a lot more carefully to be able to tell between those two things. For what it's worth, I mean, this sample size was small in that study, but not all of them were British. And many of them had never been to either of these places because they were Newcastle University students who pitch up here, don't know, they don't, some of them was like their first week in Newcastle to take part in my study. And some of them were from Pakistan. I mean, they're quite a varied set of people. So I doubt that most of them held detailed representations of those particular places. But I think your point is a good one, and it will be interesting to kind of try and tell between those two alternatives.
Great, thanks. Christina.
Thanks, Dan. That was a great overview and a lot of food for thought. In addition to this caveat that there are some elements of culture that are transmitted, perhaps even intergenerationally, it struck me that perhaps in this context there was a self-selection problem, although you started getting at it now when talking about there being university students. But I would assume that different neighborhoods had different mobility. You said that Newcastle had been depopulated, so the people who were left behind are self-selected in some ways, in some neighborhoods more than others. So there are all these interesting kind of demographic processes that might select, not to essentialize people, but like might select on certain preferences that have been acquired in a plastic way, but over different developmental timescales or something like that.
There's certainly selection on health, for example. We really know that. That's actually very well documented. That by and large, people. There's a lot of long-term chronic illness in neighborhood B, and that's partly because, for various reasons, those are the people who found it most difficult to move somewhere else.
Right.
So that would be an example of the kind of thing we're talking about.
Yeah. And I guess I wonder, I mean, all of it, it is harder to think about interventions for some of these than others. And I see why one of them seems more ethical, but it would also seem problematic if I don't know, I worry sometimes about studying kind of the metaphor of looking for things where there's light. There's also researching things that we know we can change. Or that we already understand how to change better. Is there a possibility that it's harder to move people around, right? Like it's harder to deal with self-selection, it's harder to deal with intergenerational cultural change. What's the ethical way to kind of study those processes if we don't yet have really good interventions?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I think perhaps I was gunning after a slightly different question, or at the time of doing the study, which was when we see variation, and particularly variation that seems to persist over historical time, we assume a certain account of that. And often, in fact, the data don't tell you that that's the account, right? It could be that these are acutely evoked responses, but they keep happening year after year because people keep being poor, for example. So in a way, there's a sort of deeper question, which is how do we even know that those are the causal processes? And actually, from descriptive data, that's very hard to tease apart. I'm not disputing all sorts of things go on, but it's very, very hard to kind of tease apart. But then to come to your, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I tend to think that the interventions in some of those cases might be the same, but what the cultural transmission does is give you a kind of incredible inertia about that either interventions will either peter out. So you've seen this recurrently in the West End of Newcastle, that people have spent a lot of money on like improving the shopping centre in Benwell, or improving some streets or whatever, and then actually sometimes that's really made a difference. But other times it's kind of made a difference a while, but then actually, it hasn't been enough to sort of overcome some certain issues, and gradually that sort of become dilapidated in the same old way. And then often actually been pulled down again and another 10 years later. So I think the interventions might be the same, but what the understanding of the transmission processes does is gives you a sense of the inertias. So I don't know, I haven't really answered your question, Regina. I've just sort of waffled around it, but I think it's a really good question.
Awesome, thanks. So Ayana and then Paula.
So my question is kind of related to actually, I guess, both of the last two. But when you were looking at, when you to ask people about what they thought or mention what people had said that they thought the problems were, they seem to suggest much more structural things. And I'm wondering if this is related to this sort of long-term causal processes, right? So, this is kind of broken windows theory in the US. You can't just make things look pretty if the underlying structural, system is still holding people in poverty and putting people in a position where they don't have enough and they don't have means of getting out of this position. They're chronically ill, they don't have money, any of those things. And how you kind of deal with those problems within a setting like this, right? Like what about actual monetary interventions or increasing public transit people can get to jobs or increasing childcare? Those sorts of things seem like they would have a much more long-term permanent impact on a culture than some of these other types of interventions.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, and indeed people do tend to mention things like this. On the other hand, I must say that people are also very critical of the people, of their neighbors. They're also, they say, oh, there's a lot of bad people around here, but they're quite derogatory about it, so it's not all, but they do mention a lot of these structural things. I should also say that people's intuitions about what interventions would be effective might be totally off, right? I mean, just living somewhere doesn't give you a good insight into causally what would make a difference to it any more than being a researcher does, so but yes, I think it's a sort of problem, and this between sociologists and the behavioral sciences, this dialogue goes back and forth, right? Which is in public health, you see it, right? Oh, eating, you need to learn more self-control, or you need to like read the label on the foods and stuff. And then the sociologists, yeah, hello, food poverty, this is the food system works. So it's that constant debate between. And I do think there's an issue in our discipline that doesn't entirely answer your question, which is, do the kinds of data we collect already privilege certain types of explanations, of relatively internal ones, relatively symbolic ones, whatever? Does that already privilege certain kinds of ways of thinking about things, which are kind of convenient? They're often convenient in other ways, right? I mean, politicians love nudges, for example. They love it because it's cheap and you don't have to do anything difficult. You just, stick a pair. I've been guilty of this. You stick a pair of eyes on everything, and you don't have to worry about poverty anymore. It's just everyone's nice now, So these are real issues, I think, and I don't have a good account. Was just asking the community to generate the solutions doesn't necessarily help, because they might come up with all kinds of stuff that's kind of folk theories that's not very helpful. But I suppose finding out what they do all the time, and what barriers they face. Well, here's me sounding like a sort of qualitative researcher, which is actually very different from the stuff I do, but I can see the importance of it.
Yeah, I think for a lot of those things, you need more samples, right? Like if you want to look at large scale structural problems, you can't just look at Newcastle, you have to look at, which is what sociologists absolutely do pretty well. But yeah, but yeah.
Paula.
Yeah, Paula, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Well, first, I think certainly, I mean, how old is it now? About 10 years old, something like that. You did it in the late 90s. I think it's a really good kind of contrast today. Certainly what you said about kind of looking at weird cultures, that they're not this homogeneous kind of rich, privileged demographic at all. I think that's really good. But a couple of things as well, I think you could kind of, if you're kind of interested in looking at the environmental kind of thing, if you contrast that with, say, Life on the Bottom from Darren Poole, where he's kind of looking at all the kind of psychological blocks that people might put on them. These are just things that kind of just brought up when you were talking about it. And I mean, I come from a place like that. I don't come from Newcastle. I come from a more kind of rural kind of poverty, where rural. It's Peter Lee, the lovely new town, and there it's kind of that those cultures. We're thinking about kind of self-selection. Those cultures themselves kind of select who belongs in there as well. It's like I didn't belong in there because I wanted to kind of, I was just a bit too kind of intellectual. And it wasn't that I didn't want to fit in, I just grew up kind of being told, well, you're different, you don't fit in. And then so we kind of move out as soon as we're 16. That people who kind of want to escape those places, so if they're not going to be in your samples, because you have to go elsewhere basically just to kind of thrive, because you know that you're not going to thrive in that environment. And also just, I don't know if you looked in Cowgate, but back at the time roundabout there, Cowgate was full of kind of indigenous white people and who were being sent there from mental health services. Everybody in that estate had a mental health, an acute kind of, or even really serious mental health problems, and it was a ghetto. It was a horrible, horrible place back then, and over the last 10 years, it's kind of been filled in now with kind of more kind of ethnic kind of minorities, and it's actually really quite nice now.
Yeah,
it's kind of much more kind of. But yeah, these are just things that I kind of.
Yeah, no, I agree. One of the things here is, we need more immigration. Immigration has been really positive for Newcastle. There's just no doubt about it, right? You go to the West End now, and there's like, oh yeah, houses are being done up, and people are making money, and new premises are opening up, and you can get good food and stuff. And it's because of immigration, right? We need more of it. So I know you view things very differently in the south of England, but where it's happened in the West End of Newcastle, it's been kind of transformative. So, which relates to these demographic issues that Christina was also raising. But thanks, Paul. It was more of a comment than a question, I guess. But,
yes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
thanks, Paula. So Dave, and then Andrew, and then I think we'll wrap up. Folks are kind of trickling out to go to other things, but a couple more questions.
Sure. Thanks so much, Daniel. So when you were kind of laying out the differences across neighborhood A and B, it was not surprisingly sort of a big five summary where the sociability is sort of extroversion, the trust is agreeableness, and it also made me think of conscientiousness potentially being a difference between the two. And that confluence of, say, high extroversion, low agreeableness, low conscientiousness, perhaps, in neighborhood B evoked in me the concept of psychopathy, certain forms of psychopathy. And then I thought, that's how neighborhood A might describe neighborhood B, a bunch of psychopaths. But how does neighborhood B describe that confluence of personality leading to behaviors? So for example, littering behavior, which is going to be probably a low conscientious, low agreeableness, maybe a little extroversion because you're outside and asserting yourself. How would they explain why they and their community litters more? They certainly aren't going to invoke psychopathy. And I'd also like, do they even have that concept of why things are bad in terms of a confluence of personality traits, whether it's psychopathy or some other, cultural personality, type. But also, why would they explain littering amongst themselves? Is it not a problem? Do they not see it as a bad part of their society? For example, I've known people who come from cultures of high littering in the neighborhood when I was near Chicago, and they would say they explain it as it helps give street cleaners a job to litter, and that's how they thought it was a good thing. How do you map on this explanation of why those differences are there?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I think so. Firstly, I think the short answer is I don't know. These are the kinds of questions I'd like to explore a lot more. Is actually the cognitive anthropology of this one that people think about. I mean, I think generally speaking, what explains the neighborhood difference is not really psychopathy, but more a kind of fatalism. People are going to do bad stuff. I can't control what they're going to do. It's just best if I don't get involved. There's no point in me foregoing littering because there's litter already everywhere on the streets, and I'm not going to be able to make a difference to that. No one's going to do, so that, and I see that in myself. I live in a very high litter street, very close to there, and you just think, oh, really? Can I come and be bothered to sort of, pick up everything or be too concerned about it because I know that the same is going to happen tomorrow, and so I think that's I think that study where we asked, what do you expect other people to do? And we showed it was the prevalence of cheating that people thought was higher, not the acceptability. I think that's what you'd find. People would say, well, I don't think other people are going to care. And so I'd like to actually go back and really study people's representations of the others in their neighborhood. Is it you think they're all bad? Is it you think some of them are bad? Do you think they're merely unpredictable? Is it you just think that they're changing over all the time so you don't really know who it is? You know, exactly what are you representing about other people? But we haven't explored that at all. On that note, I'd like to do some Big Five stuff and also, you know, find out how malleable. I know that Big Five tend to have high test reliability and whatnot, but it's not perfect. It's not 100%. So it'll be interesting to see how malleable that is too.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of research now on the fluctuating aspects of personality traits. We think they're stable, but they're not. And both within the individual and in a day, but also over time, and gets into the geography of personality literature too. Which
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
people move to similar places. But, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. You're still muted. Andrew, can you unmute, please?
All right. I'm sorry, I've got to forgo my question. I've got a toddler crying in the background. I'm sorry. All right. Bye-bye.
Now he needs to be muted.
Yeah, no, he's. I don't know. I don't hear toddler. Well, so I think, you know, there's a little ambiguity about when this should end. And normatively, we wrap up kind of these meetings around 5. So we've had some people kind of trickling out. But I think, you know, we can kind of wrap it up here if there are no more questions from folks. Does anybody have yeah, Paula.
Just the things what you were writing in when you were saying about fatalism. I think when I kind of visit the 2 different kind of cultures, that is something that I definitely see kind of in a working class environment. People expect to be taken care of. They blame the government more for things they don't really kind of see themselves as need of having any kind of agency that will make a difference, or enough of a difference to actually bother, you know, just trying in the first place. So yeah, that fatalism is, I think, a big deal.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of evidence that that's true in the health domain, for example.
Yeah, and also a kind of social cynicism, right? It's really interesting question how to kind of rectify that. Like on the one hand, it seems like there's, you know, potentially a kind of almost pluralistic ignorance. Like if you could get everybody onto a new equilibrium, right, and kind of coordinate a movement to a new place, I mean, that would be one reason for optimism, but then you still have the material conditions, right? It's like even the people that they trust, they think they'll still get robbed by, because those people need things, right? And it's like, how are they going to get them otherwise without solving the economic, the material, the, you know, food security issues? It's not clear any other equilibrium will be stable, right? As long as
I mean, it's an interesting question, right? And I think we don't know the balance of the structural and the for want of a better word, cultural, you know, the socially propagated. We don't really know the balance of those. And I mean, my feeling is there's probably a bit of slop, right? You know, that you know, I'm enough of a sort of vulgar Marxist to think in the end, if people haven't, you know, got enough resources, that's going to affect things. But I also think there's quite a lot of slop between the base and the superstructure in Marxist language. Yeah. So the material determinants, you know, and the kind of social consequence. I think there's quite a lot of slop, and there's quite a lot of space for, you know, getting a different outcome with possibly only minor tweaks to the. But ultimately, you know, the material distribution is pretty important as well.
Yeah, and how to kind of stoke the, you know, potential pooling of resources, because this kind of like theft is just moving the resources around that potentially could be shared more productively in a kind of mutualistic way. And it made me think about, you know, your comment that there's not the kind of social infrastructure, like the community centers aren't there. You don't have, you know, somewhat top-down investment, but maybe, you know, like the businesses aren't stable in that environment either, because the economic incentives aren't there. Like would, you know, introducing those kinds of spaces for establishing shared, basically common knowledge about who other people are and what they want? Like, does that have some potential?
So one of the things that the local council certainly says is that there are actually various funds that are kind of allocated for deprived areas. And one of the things is people they struggle to get together. It's partly the bureaucratic thing of accessing that, but they struggle to get together the kind of neighborhood associations and so on that would allow them to success, because that's already a social coordination thing. And in fact, middle class areas are brilliant at coming up with a neighborhood group that claims some fund, whatever. So, but the sort of place where it's least needed. So there is a sort of social coordination aspect of all these things.
Might be a point of entry for a researcher to make
Absolutely.
some positive contribution.
Absolutely. And also, just to come back to our question about the material distribution and the sort of and the social nexus. Of course, those two things over time do have reciprocal interactions. There's not, the causality is not all going one way, and because of course economic growth happens and places become more attractive and people move in, and so things do occur.
So Christina, I think you get maybe the final word. Are you?
She can't
trying to put your hand down or trying to unmute? All right. Well, Andrew's back. The toddler is appeased.
Yeah, somewhat. Okay. So yeah, I think maybe you guys were getting to something similar to what I wanted to ask, which was about personal precarity. How precarious is my existence? It seems like if you could measure have some sort of measure of that, of how precarious I feel my existence is. Right. This would be, you see really sharp delineations between these neighborhoods. And I think it's really interesting that something Paula said about ethnic minorities, perhaps new immigrant groups coming into places and changing them in some ways for the better. I think it might be interesting to see if their change in personal precarity from where they have been to where they are now might explain some of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I would like to study those things. And in fact, I've got an unrelated project now, which is about the concept of desperation. Right? Do you view yourself as close to a disastrous edge, and that psychologically important? And there might be variation between, how far are you away from the kind of, nightmare? That could be, there's reasons for thinking that could be psychologically really important. The other thing that would be good to have about this is longitudinal data, because the thing about is it's not just that people, for example, in food insecurity, people are not hungry all the time, but they are hungry sometimes. And it's actually more that there's just these unpredictable variations. Similarly, people are not, not without income in these kinds of places, but their income does fluctuate quite a lot in various ways because they're on shift work, casual work, benefits delays, there's a whole load of things. So, I mean, in a way, what characterizes our income is not just that it's relatively high, but it's actually extremely predictable. We're not fluctuating around, right? Neither your outgoings or your income is probably fluctuating that much. So I'd really like to study people's sense of that over time. And also their perception of how unpredictable they think the others in their neighborhood are. Because I could be fine, but if I think the people around me are okay today, but God knows tomorrow if they'll be starving, that's going to change my mindset immediately. What inferences I make about how predictable others' lives are. So I'd like to study those things, definitely.
Daniel, are you familiar with Catherine Townsend's recent work with the ick? So this is Colin Turnbull's mountain people, right, who were described as like the most selfish people in history. So she's gone back recently and done kind of multi-method studies, but basically found them to be quite generous now. And in fact, when Turnbull was studying them, it was a like once in 1,000-year drought. And it was basically, people at the extreme of precarity and desperation, who didn't have, anything to share.
But I mean, I think Turnbull did admit that was the case, though he does also make these rather dark comments about, their culture is irrevocably bust,
Yeah, and it's, it's certainly been, that's what's been taken and kind of amplified. But there was, there's a kind of bounce back when the ecology changed as well.
No, I'm sure.
But it's a nice kind of case study now of that flexibility, as it were.
Yeah, sure. Christina's made a comment about inequality as opposed to material factors. So I'm actually quite I have quite a slightly sort of deflationary approach to accounts based on inequality as opposed to, as it were, individual material resources, which is certainly in the literatures I read, and there might be some in social psychology that are different. Many of the purported effects of inequality, like the Gini coefficient as a predictor, can be reinterpreted as being mediated through individual income. Because if you make countries or states more unequal, and there's a non-linear function mapping, well-being or whatever to income, then what you do is you push some people really a long way down because it's concave that way. And so, of course, things get worse for a whole bunch of people, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the inequality that's causally doing it in people's heads. It might just be where you're moving them. Now, I don't deny that there is social comparison. We do compare ourselves to one another, but in a way that would sort of suggest that mixed neighborhoods will be kind of psychologically worse, right? Because at least you're around other people who are largely poor as well. That ought to be better. And I don't have the intuition that that's right. I think the opposite is probably true, but I don't know. I thought all of the evidence was that concentrated disadvantage made it worse. It was intensifying to be not only poor yourself, but surrounded by others who are poor. Whereas from an inequality point of view, you might make the opposite prediction that it would be really bad to be rich and surrounded by, but poor and surrounded by rich people, like the ethnic density effect, right? Which is a similar thing, but for ethnicity. So I don't know if that was your question, Ian.
Well, I was just going to add to that there is stuff in social psychology that looks at this, but I think there's like a threshold at the bottom of which the effects are just bad, right? So under a certain level, poverty is just poverty, but above that, the psychological effects of like how deprived you feel and it is relative to the people around you.
Yeah. So if you've got some references on that, would you possibly mind sending?
I will try to dig them up. It's been a really long time.
There's some stuff on lottery winners. Like it's really bad for their neighbors' well-being when people win the lottery.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of stuff in the like money happiness literature, like how much money it takes to make people happy, that covers this. Although that literature is a bit iffy and a bit tedious, but there definitely is a bunch of stuff looking at like kind of the relative effects of if you are quite wealthy but live, like if you're making 6 figures and everyone around you is making 7, all of a sudden your ability to keep up is very stressful and can have like really quite psychologically detrimental impacts that you would not expect from someone making really a lot of money. Right? But yeah, there's definitely a baseline threshold, and it's higher than I think most people expect in terms of when those effects start.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? Like it seems that if we take a really large scale cross-cultural perspective, like what we think of as needs has to be endogenous somehow, right? Like there's no way that there's so many people in my social network who think they need a separate room because their child was born, and there's no way that that's true in most of the pre-urban modern world. And when you talk about like food insecurity, I know there is food insecurity in the US, in the UK, but it's got to be magnitudes of different in terms of what food insecurity means when like starvation is on the table. So I just wonder how that fits into like how that fits into the psychology somehow.
I think that's right, but actually, I think that we should be wary of making too many assumptions about that, right? Because this is why we need the road to Wigan Pier in a way. Because actually, I was just reading a thing that there's a lot of kids in Leeds, for example, who don't have beds. I mean, there's actually a charity that gets beds, right, from people who are clearing out beds and takes them to people's houses. So, of course, you're right, Christina, absolutely. But I just think we shouldn't assume that we know. So, for example, food insecurity, which I've done a bit of work on, I'd like to do more. I'd actually like to know what that food insecurity is like and how does it compare with other populations, because I don't think we know by speculating. I think you really need to go there and do experience sampling or do diary studies or really actually do something in quite a lot of detail before you could be sure. I suspect you're probably right. I mean, that there is a sense in which that's endogenous. That must be true. And I'm interested in this notion of desperation, because clearly, what desperation looks like must be endogenous in some respects, right? Desperation for a British person is not desperation for someone in Fiji or whatever. It must look very different. And I think it must be the point at which you feel you've lost social personhood, which under some ecologies might also be literal personhood. You might literally die. But I think it's sort of an equally awful outcome for people. It's to not die, but not be able to sort of be a fully participatory human, as that's sort of defined locally. So that's, I think just knowing what those things are, is very interesting. And I think we don't know a priori, but I think generally speaking, you must be about right.
Yeah, great. Well, Daniel, thank you.
You're welcome.
I thought that was a most excellent way to kick off our seminar series on community engaged research. I think there's, many more things that we can continue talking about. And I hope, you and the CCE can kind of pursue those lines. You mentioned virtual reality a few times. I believe we have some VR equipment as part of a kind of community research toolkit that we've put together. So there's some potential there, but then, for some studies maybe. But thank you again, and thanks all for attending. It was a pleasure. Right all.
Thank you, Daniel.
Cheers. See you soon.
Thank you, Matt.
Bye.
Cheers.